everybody. Welcome to our lecture on regimes and the role of ideology in legitimizing regimes. So far we've learned one way to compare states to one another. We can compare them in terms of state capacity. Now we're going to compare them on a different spectrum, that is, on their regime type. What is a regime type, you ask? Well, the textbook definition of a regime is that it is the set of fundamental rules and institutions that govern political activity. So a state's regime is the basic contours of how politics works within that state. Some of the regime types we'll discuss today are liberal democracy, communism and fascism, modernizing authoritarianism, and semi-authoritarianism. Regimes work to define the fundamental relationship between a state and the people living in that state. The regime determines the interactions between rulers and the ruled. This begs the question of who those rulers and who those ruled are. Well, let's start by thinking about what constitutes the people. One conception of the people is that they are subjects. Here the relationship of the ruled to their rulers is that the ruled owe duty and subservience to their rulers. They do not have rights or privileges outside of the whims of a ruler. Indeed, this is a relationship with a ruler. Think back on feudalism and the concept of fealty, in which loyalty was to a lord or a king, and kings swore loyalty to the person of the pope. It is not about political units, but about the individual. This conception of the people is largely defunct now, at least in terms of being seen as legitimate. Now we tend to see people as a group of citizens. A citizen, like a subject, has certain duties and obligations. The state can still coerce you, and you must do certain things like pay taxes, follow the rule of law, and even serve in the military in many countries. However, citizens also have rights. Finally, citizenship is a legal relationship with a political entity, the state. It is not a relationship with an individual ruler. When the leadership changes, our citizenship does not. So how did this happen? How did this shift from subject to citizen occur? Well, we're not going to go into a whole lot of great detail here. Suffice to say, the state became the dominant form of political organization, as we've discussed, and as that happened, it made a lot more sense to have a relationship with the state than with individual rulers. As Enlightenment ideals elevated the notion of individuality and introduced the idea of individual rights, civil society began to bloom, and people were seen to have rights, not just obligations. Thus, most citizens don't just accept anything from their rulers. Therefore, legitimacy is now a very important part of political authority. And this is why we're going to talk about ideology. Ideologies help give regimes their legitimacy. Legitimacy is key to the state. Indeed, think back on Weber's definition of the state as a political unit that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. As regimes specify the relationship between citizens and the state, they tend to include some sort of built-in ideology to endow this arrangement with legitimacy. Why is this so important? Well, remember, first and foremost, states rule. They do this with a combination of coercion, that is force, and cooperation. Now, using brute force and coercion all the time is very costly, bloody business. States simply can't rely upon it all the time, and it is very much a last resort for most states. Thus, states rely upon a great deal of cooperation from their citizens in order to rule, and citizens will cooperate with their states best when they see that state as legitimate. Thus, states really want legitimacy, and they try to find ways to get it. An ideology can fit the bill. Ideology can mean many things, but here we'll loosely refer to it as a worldview. It's a theory about the way the world should look. Thus, it's primarily a normative theory, but because ideologies also include premises about how the world works, they have elements of empirical theory mixed in as well. Ideologies can specify what the true relationship between states and citizens should be. Where citizens buy the story, they'll think that the state is legitimate. Indeed, even when the state is very flawed, a citizen who believes the basic structure of the state is the best that it could be will give that state the benefit of the doubt much of the time. So how else could states get legitimacy? Well, in theory, a state that performed perfectly, that always delivered economic growth, perfect justice, and great public services, wouldn't really need a legitimizing ideology. It would be legitimate because it's the best there is. As we'll see, some regime types do include aspects of performance to legitimate themselves. This is tricky, however, because no country experiences perfect economic growth and perfect justice all the time. Legitimacy is a more reliable way of staying in power in lean times. So let's talk about some political regimes that we see in the world today. There are lots of different kinds, and we're going to hone in on just a few. We won't talk about monarchy or theocracy because though both have been historically important, they're not very prevalent in the world today with a few notable exceptions. We're going to start with democratic regimes. This is probably the most powerful ideology, especially in the United States, but really all over the world today. And at its root, it's liberal democracy. There are other kinds of democracy, notably social democracy, which is popular in Europe, but really the root of what we call democracy refers to the central ideals of liberal democracy. So what are those central ideals? Liberal democracy is rooted in classic liberalism. Now, note here that this is not at all the same as American liberalism, in the sense of liberals versus conservatives in American politics. Classic liberalism refers to a political philosophy coming out of the Enlightenment from theorists such as Locke, Rousseau, and John Stuart Mill. In fact, the notion of liberal democracy and its historical development came largely out of England, and while Americans might have a claim to the first self-consciously liberal democratic constitution, England started the process of developing liberal democracy centuries earlier, and they did that by beginning to put restrictions upon their leaders. Here you can see the picture of King John signing the Magna Carta way back in 1215. This is where English lords asserted that they had certain rights and that the crown could not infringe upon those rights. By the 17th century, the English Parliament emerged as more powerful than the monarch. The idea that people have rights and that rulers may not legitimately infringe upon these rights is central to classic liberalism and liberal democracy. Liberalism, as you could tell by the name, is rooted in liberties. Its central tenet is that all men are created equal and endowed with equal rights. Therefore, while the state is necessary to provide order for society, it must be contained and kept from infringing upon the rights of free men. Of course, the original conception of individual rights referred pretty much to rich white people, and even in its earliest conceptions in England, it was pretty much the rights of the noble class, because the nobles were those who could pressure the king. But thankfully, this conception has evolved and expanded dramatically over past centuries to include all human beings. So the central tenet of liberalism now is that all human beings have equal, unalienable rights. Note that, somewhat confusingly, classic liberalism is actually in many ways closer to contemporary American conservatism than it is actually to what we would call a liberal in the United States of America today. Both liberals and conservatives have the basic tenets of liberalism, of classic liberalism, at their basis, but liberals in the American sense add a notion of the necessity of social rights, which means they're kind of looking for more of an equality in outcomes as well, whereas classic liberals are completely fine with inequality in outcomes as long as the starting point is equality for all of the free citizens. So the notion that all have equal rights leads to the social contract, which was elucidated by an important political philosopher named John Locke. The idea is that the only just government is that government which free, equal men would choose for themselves. Thus, in a liberal democracy, the only legitimate government is that chosen by the people. This is why elections are so important to democracy, as are the notions of the people being represented in their government, and their ability to hold their rulers accountable for their actions. Thus, the legislature is the key institution of democracy, as this is the representative body chosen by the people. We will study many democracies in the next unit, and some of them do not involve the separation of powers featured in the United States of America. Where there is a legislature put in place by free and fair elections, we will typically call a system democratic. Indeed, probably the most used empirical classification of democracy in contemporary comparative politics research is quite sparse. It simply involves looking for real competition. Democracies have that real competition. As Adam Jaworski, a very famous political scientist, put it, democracy is a system in which parties lose election. So, that is our beloved democracy. Now let's turn to some less popular regime types. Communism and fascism are an odd couple. They are different sides of the political spectrum, and they are, or at least were, epic, mortal enemies. But they are also similar in two interesting ways. First, they both have very thorough ideologies, huge worldviews put in place to legitimize these systems. Second, both of these ideologies have been altered slightly by their leaders, and they ended up justifying totalitarianism. So, to see how that happened, let's start with communism. The work of Karl Marx is at the root of the communist ideology. It is a very complicated but elegant theoretical argument, which we won't get into fully here. For our purposes, it is just key to note that Marx saw human history as an evolution forward based upon the economic basis of society. He believed that capitalism was the root of democracy, and that liberal democracy was really just a system put in place by the wealthy capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, to serve their goals. He argued that over time, the workers in the bourgeois democracies would revolt and lead the way to communism, which he viewed as the pinnacle of human society. There would be no property, and there would be such perfect equality that people would eventually have no need for rulers. What is key is that communism is a step, the final step in the progression for Marx, from agrarian feudal societies to industrial democracies, democratic societies, and only then to the workers' paradise. Lenin altered this ideology. He led a communist revolution in Russia, which was about the worst case in Europe to become a communist utopia from Marx's perspective. It was still very agriculture, it had hardly modernized or industrialized at all, and it was really not at all democratic. In many ways, it was still quite feudal. Lenin, however, argued that with a vanguard party, he could lead the country through the painful transition towards eventual communism, when the party would no longer be necessary. Thus, the fact that Russia was so behind the times at the turn of the 20th century was how Lenin legitimized the rule of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, a vanguard party which Lenin's ideology legitimized to become all-powerful dictators in the name of the workers, in the name of working towards a workers' paradise. Fascism starts out very differently, but it ends up in a pretty similar place. Even though we typically associate fascism with Hitler, Mussolini actually laid it out first. All of the philosophical tenets of fascism as a core ideology were put forth by Mussolini. And at its core is intense nationalism. So equality or workers, they're not important at all in this ideology. Indeed, in fascist ideology, there is a call for strict hierarchy. The central idea is corporatism, the idea that the nation is like a body. It's an organic entity, and it should operate harmoniously. Thus, the entire body must listen to the head to function well. Of course, this head is the leader. So therefore, the good of the state outweighs all else, and there is no room for individual rights. As an individual, you're like a small, tiny part of a body. You're a cell, a part of an organ, and you have to do your one function to contribute to the greater good. And of course, that greater good is what is dictated by your supreme leader. So Hitler took the basic tenets of fascist ideology, and he added a notion of purity and racism to justify his horrendous crimes against humanity. So how do these very different ideologies lead to a similar place? Both ideologies have been used to justify totalitarianism. Now, this term gets thrown around a lot, but it in fact refers to a very specific and very rare form of government. A totalitarian state has complete power over its populace. There is no line between society and the state. The state takes over everything. That's what puts the total in totalitarianism. The state is all there is. If you have anything bad to say about the state, you're out. Indeed, in totalitarian societies, it's actually not even enough just to go along with what the leader wants. It's very mobilizing. You have to actually go out, show your support. So where in other authoritarian regimes, you can get by as long as you kind of leave politics alone and don't protest or don't put yourself out there. In totalitarian societies, that's not enough. You have to go out, go to the parades, wear the t-shirt, whatever. You've got to show your support. This is pretty scary stuff, but it's also very, very difficult to maintain. You need an overwhelmingly powerful state. So here you see the two best examples of totalitarian governments, Hitler's Nazi Germany and Stalin's Communist Soviet Union. They're both at their propaganda rallies, getting the people out. There aren't really many clear-cut cases of totalitarianism today. Maybe North Korea, but that's even debatable. Most authoritarian regimes fall quite short of the complete control that totalitarianism embodies. The regime type that we'll call modernizing authoritarianism does not really have the sort of ideological punch that communism and fascism have. These regimes have sort of a mishmash of ideologies, and they don't really have any one clear element. Some of them do work to justify themselves with elements of communist ideology or nationalist ideology, but in a much more watered-down way. These garden-variety authoritarian regimes are more likely to resort to claims of performance. As we mentioned earlier, this can be a pretty tough thing to do in the long term, so most modernizing authoritarian regimes base their legitimacy in either technocratic or neo-patrimonial ideologies. Neither of these are as cogent or elegant as liberal, communist, or fascist ideologies, which really are worldviews. They do, however, provide grounds for basic justification of the regime. Technocratic legitimacy is actually based upon the modernization theory, that theory we discussed in the research methods lecture, the one that argues that economic prosperity is a prerequisite for democracy. These leaders argue that for economic modernization to occur, the right people, that is, the highly educated elite, them, need to be in power. Elections could put the wrong people in power, i.e., not them. They argue that they need to rule to bring the state up to the point where they are ready for democracy. Thus, they try to justify postponing democratization on the grounds that democratization too early would lead to economic ruin. Pretty clever, really. It buffers the promise of prosperity with an explanation that some might buy into. If that doesn't do it for you, try on neo-patrimonial ideology. This is also kind of a mishmash, but it really boils down to sort of a callback to traditional patrimonial legitimacy, which is based upon heredity or a clan or creed, and typically involves father of the nation type rhetoric. The last kind of regime we'll look at today is semi-authoritarian regimes. This regime has many other names: competitive authoritarianism, quasi-democracy, hybrid regimes, etc. These are basically states that look a lot like democracies but aren't quite there. Namely, they have elections, which is why they are often called competitive authoritarian regimes. However, these elections are generally too flawed to be truly democratic. Think of Russia under Putin as a great example. Putin has been able to successfully ban or intimidate real competitors, and to control the media to such a tight extent that elections are not at all competitive in a meaningful way. He was able to handpick a successor, Medvedev, and then to step back into power this spring. Regimes like this legitimize themselves based upon a mix of liberal democratic and modernizing authoritarian ideologies. Like modernizing authoritarians, they say that they are the best leaders, the father of the nation, or some other such nonsense. They say that they will give you prosperity. But if that doesn't do it for you, well, they were elected anyway. This regime type has become quite popular today, as liberal democracy has come to be the most powerful legitimizing ideology internationally. Thus, leaders all over the world at least pretend to hold elections to try and imbue themselves with the legitimacy of having been chosen by the people. Wow, so that was a lot of ideology for one sitting. Now you know how to compare most modern states based upon their regime type and the way they justify their relationship to their citizens. Congratulations.